You don't live with understanding. You live first, blindly, confidently, making decisions you can't undo. And only later do you realize what they actually meant, not when it could help you, when it's already over. You sit in a room you've lived in for years and suddenly see it differently. The job you stayed in longer than you should have. The relationship you kept alive past its expiration. The person you never called back. And the understanding arrives quietly, not as revelation, just as fact. You were moving through life the only way you knew how, and now, only now, you can see the pattern. You remember moments when something felt wrong, but not wrong enough to leave, so you stayed. You told yourself clarity would come later, and it did, just not when you needed it. There was the conversation you should have ended years earlier, but you kept trying. You kept believing it would shift, that patience would be rewarded. It wasn't. There was the decision to wait, to postpone, to see how things unfold. You told yourself you'd know when the time was right, but the right time passed while you were waiting to recognize it. People talk about hindsight as if it's a gift, but hindsight doesn't change what already happened. It only clarifies why. Now you understand why people behaved the way they did, why opportunities closed, why relationships ended. But the understanding comes from a distance, from a place where you can no longer use it to change course. This isn't failure. This is how time works. Some lessons can't be taught. They can only be lived through. You can be told that youth doesn't last, but until you feel it slipping, until you notice that recovery takes longer, that energy isn't infinite, it remains abstract. Understanding requires contrast, and contrast requires time. When you're young, everything feels like preparation, like the real life is still ahead, so you wait, you plan, you assume there will be another chance to do it right, and there is, until there isn't. The moment you realize you're no longer preparing, you're already in the life you were preparing for, that's when clarity begins. But by then, certain choices are behind you, the career you didn't pursue, the place you didn't move to, the person you didn't call back. They exist now only as hypotheticals, as the shape of a life you didn't live. Experience is the only teacher that gives the test first and the lesson after. You learn what mattered by noticing what you miss. You learn what was real by watching what faded. And none of this happens quickly. It takes years to see that the argument wasn't about what you thought it was about, that the fear was covering something deeper. It takes distance to understand that you weren't wrong. You were just operating with incomplete information. And the information only becomes complete when the situation is over. Awareness doesn't make life easier, it makes it heavier. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And sometimes the knowledge doesn't help, it just explains. You understand now why your parents were the way they were. You see the pressures they were under, the limitations they faced. And that understanding doesn't erase the impact, it just adds context. You understand why you stayed in situations that hurt you, why you said yes when you meant no, but understanding why doesn't undo the years. There's a loneliness in seeing clearly, because most people are still living in the fog you just stepped out of. They're making the same mistakes, following the same logic, and you can't explain it to them, because they're not ready to hear it, just like you weren't, years ago. Awareness also means realizing how much you didn't control, how many outcomes were determined by timing, by circumstance, by forces you couldn't see. You did your best, and your best wasn't enough. Not because you failed, but because some things were never yours to solve. Understanding life late doesn't mean you wasted it. It just means you lived it the way most people do, without a script, without advance notice. But late understanding still offers something. It offers perspective. The ability to see your own life as a story with shape, with reasons, Even if you didn't write them intentionally, it offers forgiveness, not the performative kind, the quiet kind, the kind where you stop being angry at yourself for not being someone you couldn't have been yet. And maybe that's what late understanding is for, not to rewrite the past, but to let it finally rest. Some people spend their entire lives running from what they didn't get right, analyzing, relitigating. But eventually you realize the wondering doesn't change anything. Late understanding lets you put it down, not because you solved it, not because you made peace with it in some grand final way, but because you're tired of carrying it, and understanding gives you permission to stop. You understand life only after it's mostly over, not because you were slow, not because you failed to pay attention, but because understanding is always retrospective. It only becomes clear when the choices are behind you, and by then you can't go back. Maybe the point was never to understand in time to avoid the pain. Maybe the point was just to understand it all,